All right, first and foremost, thank you all for being here this evening to celebrate my friend's book release. Jonathan, congrats.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for generously hosting this conversation today, and thank you all for being here. You write something about your family and the people closest to you in over a period of long nights and weeks and months, and it just feels really great to see your community show up and the people that you care about be here for you. So it means a lot. It means a lot to see you guys here. So thank you.
Yeah. I want you to tell folks the name of the book, give a quick description, and then read some from it, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Great.
And we'll have some time at the end for your questions too.
Can everybody hear okay? The name of the book is The Mind is Burning, Losing My Father to Occult and Dementia. It's the story of my life. It's a story of my life with my father, who, for those of you here who know him or don't, was a quite eccentric and quite difficult man. He grew up in Budapest, Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution. He arrived in the United States and met my mom in the 1980s in the midst of the New Age movement in Northern California. They were both spiritual seekers in search of brighter, more enlightened pastures, I guess you could say. They met in line at the Moscone Center in San Francisco for a darshan, which is like a spiritual meditation with a guru. Eventually, they became friends and then partners, and then they got married and they had me. And when they had me, they joined a controversial spiritual group, a group that many people believe to be a cult, in about 1986. And our life was forever changed by that experience. And so some of you may have heard the podcast Dear Franklin Jones, which talks a great deal about that. But I think in the memoir, it sort of picks up where that leaves off, which is the years that followed. But I'll read for you a passage from the book. It is the 5th chapter in the book. It's called The Mind is Burning. The day our house burned down, my parents were in the room down the hall having sex. They said before the fire they'd been sitting in front of the fireplace. It was a cool evening in late summer, and they were reading the paper and listening to music before retiring into the adjoining room. I had gone to bed in my room a couple of hours earlier. I just started 6th grade when it happened. Although the flames inside the fireplace had subsided long before they closed the double doors and lied down together, embers must have leaped out of it and ignited a stack of dry newspapers on the rug. They failed to notice the smoke squeezing through the cracks in the door and filling up the room until it had stretched halfway across the ceiling. I was unaware of the coming disaster because my room was near the front of the house, connected to theirs by a narrow hall and shared bath. With one ear pressed against a handheld radio, I listened to the San Francisco Giants as they struggled through the 1995 season. I was 11 years old. I was an only child who insisted on sleeping in a bunk bed, who played one-on-one basketball with himself and dreamed of being a point guard for the New York Knicks. Though we lived under the same roof, our lives could not have been more different. That summer, I'd begun to absorb a number of things in the popular culture. I'd enshrined my walls with the heroes of the shopping mall frame store. Famous left fielder slugger Barry Bonds, Hall of Fame wide receiver Jerry Rice, Bob Marley, Kurt Cobain, all above my bed with thumbtacks. On their walls, you find framed photos of Indian mystics, such as Ramana Maharshi and Sri Ramakrishna, Tibetan deities, Hindu gods. There were bookshelves filled with obscure Zen texts and New Age philosophies. Often I would retreat to the privacy and comfort of my room to organize my baseball cards or listen to Nirvana CDs, seeking an escape from the unconventional interests of my spiritualist family. That night, I heard a stampede down the hall, then Mom and Dad bursting through the door of my room. My dad shouted, "Get the hell out of bed, son." His naked ass scooped up my middle school gym sweats and our cat. He tussled briefly with the furniture that obstructed his exit and bolted out of the house. He left me to figure out what to do with myself. I don't remember my mom rushing to my side either. As I reached the front door, I looked back one last time before following my parents into the street. I felt paralyzed by what I saw. Wires were dangling in the air out of the crumbling walls, sparking wildly and bursting into flames. The fire moved quickly along the carpet like a striking snake. I was scared of this dangerous and thundering world my home had become. We waited outside in the driveway. The fire trucks arrived, the police arrived, the neighbors all put their slippers on and stood with their arms crossed as they watched everything we owned go up in smoke. I don't know what to think, didn't know what to think or feel. We just stood there, stunned by what had happened. That smell of half-burned things. It stays with you forever, sweet and pungent, like the smell of logs you might use to smoke brisket. Recently, I encountered a speech that was given by the Buddha on a hill in the Gaya province of India, shortly after his enlightenment. It is a famous text, one you will likely have found on my parents' shelf among the other books that were strewn in crisped and half-burned piles of rubble. In the speech, the Buddha explains how everything that we see, taste, touch, smell, and hear is in fact burning. It is burning with the fire of illusion, with desire and attachment, with our own futile need to experience and own all the intangible, transient things that make up our universe. When I read the Adita Sutta, or the Fire Sermon, this moment crackles in my mind, snaps and pops, rumbles and simmers. Once we hurried our way down the stairs and out of harm's way, all that was left was for us to wait. The fire had been contained. We got in the car. My mom turned on the cassette deck, and my dad turned up the volume on a tape of South Indian chants, and we waited for the Red Cross to arrive. They would later provide us with a place to stay and a stipend to purchase new furnishings, money that my parents quickly blew on impulse buys and probably a Buddhist knick-knack or two. I can't remember, but I do remember that I spent my portion on sports jerseys and a New York Knicks parka twice my size. And I rolled into class the next day smelling like burnt wood and looking like a mascot. We went on in silence for some time listening to the music. And what happened next was truly unbelievable. My dad broke the silence. He turned to look at my mom, and what he must have seen as a feat of comedic timing, he dryly said, "Well, I guess it was time for us to let go of all that stuff too." And then he paused before he chuckled. Then my mom chuckled. Then I chuckled. And soon he was laughing, and my mom was laughing, and I was laughing. And we must have looked utterly insane sitting in the carport of our recently incinerated home while rescue workers contained the fire, police officers filed reports, and aid agencies filled out the necessary paperwork to grant us emergency supplies. We would spend years rebuilding our lives. And to this day, over 25 years later, I bet you, my parents still have items stashed away in storage with that ashy cedar smell. But above all, I remember our laughter, how it consumed the moment like a burning plague. When I was young, the version of this story I wrote and performed was full of promise. Who needs things anyway, right? Throw them all away, I said in versions of it I used to perform at open mics and poetry readings in my 20s. I was not accessing the pain of the years leading up to that moment. I was not seeing the event for what it was. I had not seen what happens when you enter the final chapter of your life empty-handed. I had yet to have people that mattered enough to me that I might die so that they could live. I did not understand how my dad's spiritual quest was also a clever cover for a lifetime of scorched earth. Thomas rarely spoke about his own father in childhood, except to say that his dad wasn't around much. He was a drunk, addicted to gambling, and cheated on Thomas's mother. Once he tried to get in between an altercation with his mom and dad that had gotten physical, and realized his father wouldn't have been above using violence against him too. I have this one portrait of him. He has that same round-shaped face my dad has, and perhaps it's that photo, the photo is in black and white, but there's a harsher tone to his natural expression. His skin looks tougher. His upper lip is plastered in a finely trimmed mustache. He does not look like a paragon of gentleness. While he generally criticized his ways and means, there were times when Thomas seemed to seek some kind of redemption from his father. He'd almost seem to justify the abuse he'd suffered in these moments. It was wartime, he'd say. Life was chaotic and dangerous, and there wasn't space to be sentimental, to dwell on one's feelings about how to treat others with courtesy and kindness. He showed me his love by keeping me safe. A story he frequently invoked about the scar that stretched across half of his forehead, a quarter-inch deep. A Nazi air raid had descended on Budapest. Shrapnel from the bomb had hit Thomas in the head. He was semi-conscious and bleeding on the street. He was 4 years old. His dad grabbed a rifle from inside the house and held a taxi cab at gunpoint, demanding that he take his injured child to the hospital. And this, I suppose, was the kind of dedication Thomas saw as a demonstration of love from his father. Even as a young person, these stories, when he deigned to tell them, always felt to me like they had a message. You have no idea how bad it could get. So don't bother me with all this little stuff. You, by the way, and anything you could possibly conjure up as a grievance are little stuff. And in the way kids do, I heeded this warning in silence and mostly observed him from afar. The truth is, I never spent time with my dad as a child. He never took me for a walk in the neighborhood. He never attended my basketball games. He never sat next to me as I played with my toys in the living room or asked me about my day. We never went on a trip together, just the two of us, even for a day. He never attended a single school function. No parent-teacher conferences, no after-school events, none of that. On the occasion when we were alone together or he'd drive me to school, the time passed mostly in silence, punctuated by the long draws on his weed pipe at stop signs and red lights. The windows of the car always rolled up. We never played a video game together. We never shared a meal while Mom was working. It felt like I simply didn't exist to him. I would come home from school, and the door to his room would be closed for hours at a time, weed smoke trailing out of the bedroom, the low volume of porn movies coming from the VHS player. And thinking back, it's shocking how out in the open he was about his addictions, how little it seemed to bother him that I'd be bearing witness to that each day. I'm sure he didn't think about it. The Thomas that I knew growing up seemed, you could say, preoccupied. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, but his aloof nature felt like a form of withholding. I shrank when he entered the room, wished that this smaller, less intrusive version of myself would be interesting to him. That shrinking came from another instinct, self-protection. He never hit me, but he didn't have to. His rage was loud and out of control. It tore up the house. He was overly defensive, quick to spark up in anger if he felt betrayed or crossed by someone, and his threshold for feeling that way was frighteningly low. When a confrontation went sour, he had no qualms about cutting people entirely out of his life. His personal history was littered with such altercations and former friends, many of whom would come out of the woodwork later. The emotional pace of the room could go from 0 to 60 in seconds. And if you experience that over and over, it teaches you a key lesson in self-protection. Make yourself scarce when the temperature rises, because your parent has absolutely no problem burning it all down.
Well, wow. Thank you. Very good. Congrats again. I have a whole list of questions written, but I want to ask about the way you described the spiritual group that you and your family were in.
Yeah.
You called it just now a fringe spiritual group that some might call a cult.
Yeah.
We have talked at length about how you actually define a cult, how lots of folks get it wrong.
Yes.
When did you realize that your family was in one?
I don't think I realized that I believed my parents were in a cult until I had finished the podcast documentary, Dear Franklin Jones, which I did in 2017.
Wow.
Yeah. It took me that long, and I think a huge part of making that show was wrestling with the idea precisely of what a cult is. Because we all think we know what a cult is. It's like a scary place where people get controlled by an overly controlling leader. Well, precisely what does that mean? Like, I think right now we live in a cultural moment where we've conflated what like high control, coercive control groups that in the 80s and 90s would have been referred to as cults are with being a fan of Taylor Swift.
Well, and we use the language in all of this stuff.
Yeah, cult favorite, cult classic.
Yeah.
Trumpism is a cult. Like, let's join a cult.
Yeah.
I mean, the notion, that phrase is very fraught. But I think when groups like Franklin Jones's group emerged in the 70s and 80s, I think what the term cult was seeking to understand and define were the parameters of authoritarian religious movements.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah.
Which can be anything from evangelical Christian groups.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
You ended up sharing a doc with me that has your kind of clinical definition of a cult. I want you to share it with the crowd.
Yeah. I mean, to me, a cult is a group where, I mean, it needs to possess a certain key factors, but it is driven by an ideology, and that ideology can only be accessed by one individual. And in order to access that information through that individual, you need to go through various different practices, oftentimes in the form of sacrificing money, resources, your time, your mind,
your body.
And then once you have crossed over the threshold of that sacrifice, then you are promised a special access to something different, more privileged, more enlightened.
Yeah. It's funny hearing you say this, because there's a scene that you described so vividly where once I heard it, I said, oh yeah, that kid's in a cult. You're like what? 12 years old, less than 12 years old.
Yeah.
But you're talking about how in grade school you get to go to school and like be a kid around the other kids, and you like basketball and you like stuff that kids like, and then you come home and you're in the world of your parents who are wrapped up in the world of Franklin Jones, and you talk about how they have a cardboard cutout of him at the house that they worship.
Right
when you walk in the door.
Yeah.
What did young Jonathan think of that?
It's really amazing. I mean, being a parent now too, I think about this a lot. The moment at which you recognize your own private experience as different than others.
Yeah.
We didn't invite people over to the house. I didn't know why. I guess we just weren't a house where people came over. It didn't seem odd to me because I didn't know how any other houses were, because I oftentimes wasn't going to other people's houses either.
Yeah.
But when you walk in the door of our house, right on the front there was precisely what was always in the front of the house, was a life-size cardboard cutout of Franklin Jones. And it seemed normal to me that when you wake up in the morning, you take a flower, you put it at the feet of the cutout. I know it seems like magical thinking to most people, but it was normal to us.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of your day.
Yeah. So you weren't really into it the way your parents were into it, but you talked about, I don't know, is faking it the right phrase to kind of get some approval from your father?
Yeah.
When does that start, and what does that look like?
I mean, I think my parents were also in were sort of at an arm's length from the group for many years. So even in those times when they would meditate on images of him, they weren't deeply involved in the group until I got a little bit older. So when I was 10, 11 years old, middle school age, you know, I was starting to socialize in a way that I think put pressures on them to make decisions about how they wanted to live their life. And at that precise moment, Jones, who had been living in a remote island in Fiji, where some of his followers
This
live.
guy. Wow.
Yeah. Raymond Burr actually owned the island, and they purchased it from Raymond Burr.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so there's a little Hollywood.
Okay. Yeah.
Always.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, when he came back to Northern California, then there was an urgency for anybody who was in the Bay Area to be involved in the group. And so they, I think, became increasingly involved. And on the weekends, I had CYO tournaments for basketball.
Yeah.
And that became a problem for my dad. And at one point, after we had been fighting about them wanting me to go with them and me not wanting to go, he told me that I could find another place to live if I didn't want to go.
And you're how old? That's wild.
Yeah.
That's wild.
And he meant it. I know sometimes people say those things and you don't know if they mean it. He meant it.
How did you know he meant it?
He meant it because my mom tried to soften it up. And she really, I think, thought that if we didn't resolve things,
that he would kick you out.
Actually not be able to live there.
Wow.
Who knows if he meant that he would act on it?
Yeah.
But he meant it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. We were talking yesterday about this experience, and I had a similar one because I grew up not in a cult, but in a very Pentecostal black church, which can many times feel like it. My mom got mad about something I did once when I was like 12, and she's like, "Oh, well, get out!" You know, in the heat of anger, I left. Like, I'll show you. 3 hours later, she and our pastor come to rescue me. So in hindsight, I'm like, "Oh, that wasn't a cult. They kind of helped me out."
Yeah.
But
because they bluffed.
Yeah, they bluffed. We played chicken, I won. But I continually compare my experience to yours.
Yeah.
Because I would jokingly tell folks in adults that, "Oh yeah, my church was a cult." It wasn't. And I wonder, in your adulthood, talking about this story, do you ever disbelieve yourself when you're talking about it? Because it sometimes feels so big and out there.
Yeah.
You know, you're able to rationally craft this narrative that becomes a book, and you've talked about it in podcasts before. But you do it so rationally.
Yeah.
How did you get to that place? Because if I had gone through what you've gone through, I would always speak about it with histrionics.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it was important for me to lay some kind of rational groundwork to understand it in order to live. Because I think this isn't exactly answer the question, but I think
it was a meandering question. It's fine.
In a different way, something that I feel really strongly is underappreciated and not understood very well, is the lived experience of people who grow up in cults or high control groups, cult kids, if you will, and what it does to a person to inherit a system of beliefs that are that coercive and that authoritarian. Just to put this in context for folks that might not be familiar, by the time my parents left Franklin Jones's group, he believed himself to be a unique physical manifestation of God. His body was divinity and had been descended. This divinity had descended into his body. The spiritual fairy dust had trickled down into his body, such that to be touching him, to be in his proximity, was to experience godliness. And that the only way, my dad used to joke about this, like, I am the way to me. Like the only way to become divine was to become him. And the only way to become him was to worship him as God and to eliminate your own idea of self, sense of self.
Yeah.
I have a complicated relationship to self. I know we all do.
Yeah.
I get that, but mine feels it's a different kind of complication, a very specific complication with self. And in large part, I feel like it has motivated me to seek rationale, at least a framework to understand it, so that I can proceed with my life. Because I still hear those things.
Mm-hmm.
You still feel them in your body when you hear those words and those ideas for decades. You have to be able to move forward with some foundation.
I guess what I'm asking is, you don't seem too angry about it anymore.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell me how you got there. Succinctly. It's in the book, I know, but like, this is, this is something that everyone is always talking about, moving through their feelings and working through their emotions, and it's like half of all podcasting is talking about that. And you have done this beautiful thing where you've actually done it and produced a work that feels stripped of the anger that could have been there.
Typed furiously.
Just wondering where it went and how you got through it.
A big part of it was therapy, but in a very particular way. I knew I was going to write this book. I knew that I needed to get to the other side of all of this. And at the time at which I had entered into therapy.
What time was that?
Right when I started writing the book. Not the first time, but that.
Damn, I've been in therapy in many years and I haven't written a book yet.
You've got to try it.
Continue.
But the particular kind of therapeutic process I was going through was directly tied to the writing of this. So in a very unique way, I actually felt privileged to be able to take each chunk of my life. Like that section of the book that I read to you all a moment ago, there's a section there where I'm detailing all the things that happened in my childhood where my dad wasn't. That was an exercise. Right?
Really? In therapy?
Yeah.
Huh?
Take the movie reel of your life.
I've been doing it wrong. I've been paying Jonathan many years. My Jonathan, the therapist. Continue. I've been paying him. Keep going.
So wrong bank account.
I know, right? Keep going.
Yeah, well, so I did the movie reel in my head. Where is he? Can you find him anywhere? And it was a very heartbreaking and sad experience, but I couldn't find him. The man just was not there. He literally didn't. He was like a ghost.
Wow.
I could find him in the house.
Yeah.
Behind the door.
Yeah.
But I did not find him in my life. So I'm not saying that I wasn't angry and sad and frustrated through the writing, but it was healing. I mean, it was truly, for me, the telling yourself stories in order to live.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful you said about living through and working through the trauma of your youth and other kinds of trauma and knowing how to move through it and when to leave it. Something you said was a lot of times your body will know when it's time to leave.
Yeah.
When did your body know it was time to fully separate from your father and Franklin Jones, and what was that feeling or that moment, if there was one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two arcs in the story as it was written. My story.
Yeah.
One was leaving Franklin Jones's group when I was 17, which I did not choose. My parents wanted to leave, and at that time I did not want to go. So I was in a state.
Yeah.
So that was many years of trying to forget that, and then making Dear Franklin Jones was a way through that experience of him and what he meant to me. But then when my dad got sick, I found that I no longer had time to reconcile my feelings about him and his role in this, because you can maybe tell a little bit from the passage that I read, but he was his own sort of mini guru, with aspirations that weren't too different from Jones's. I mean, if you had given him the leash, he would have done it, I feel like.
Really?
I do. I think he admired Franklin Jones. Maybe even wanted to be him. Not in the way that people actually wanted to be him, like the meditating thing, but like in the like, you're a role model kind of way. And so it was difficult to, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to work through this was to sort of document how I came to a place where I was okay with letting him go. And he has dementia, which is a very long goodbye. The first title of this book was So Long. It takes so long. And also, I wanted to be able to say goodbye to this person and feel at peace with it. And for me, what I write about in the book, my memory of feeling like my body had let go of all this was when I went to visit him. I want to say this was it had to have been about 18 months ago.
Recent.
Very recent. And, you know, he doesn't hear very well. He's constantly losing his hearing aids. And they have this, he lives in a nursing facility. Most of the time it's even worse now, but most of the time he's basically catatonic. But they have this little whiteboard by the side of his bed, so people could like write him questions and could respond to them. And I wrote on a question board, on the little whiteboard, to tell him that my wife and I were having a second son. And I think it's not smart to read too much into the mind of a person with dementia. You never really know whether they have a full tank of gas at any point in time. But this felt real to me. And there was a rawness to the way that he responded to me, which was fear.
Yeah. Say more about that.
His eyes got wide, and he said, "Oh no." And then he paused for a second, and he said, "We really can't escape now."
Wow.
And he was saying that to himself. I mean, to anybody with two kids, maybe that was, maybe it was more prescient than I give him credit for. But I felt that very deeply in that moment, because I realized that this person was never ready to be a parent. And
in that moment, do you have anger? Do you have sadness? Do you you see him say that, hear him say that? You realize he's not fit to be a parent, but what are the emotions around that in that moment?
I mean, I just felt I felt relief.
Really?
Truly. I felt relief because it was something about that that was so deep. You know, an 80-plus-year-old man with dementia who's mostly not there, coming to remind you that you're trapped with your second kid at the moment that you're telling him he's going to be a grandfather. There's no coming back from that as a person. And if that was true to him, which it felt just for that split second like it was, then the person that was there, that saw his role within being in my family, being family, he was not going to be able to get past his own trauma and own grief and pain of a really difficult life and childhood, to be present in my life, to show up in the way that I know my generation of parents and many of the people here that I know show up for their kids.
I love that.
So it just wasn't going to happen. You know?
There's a moment after, maybe estranged is too strong of a word, but after not really having your father in your life and your adulthood, he comes back into your life because he's getting sick. Take us to that moment. What happens and what's going through your head?
Yeah, so we were in the middle of a very busy time. My wife and I had just had our first baby, and I was running a successful production company, and we had an opportunity to be even more successful. It was a very, very busy moment. This is peak podcasting, which I'm sorry, Sam, we shared the trajectory of.
Rode that way.
Yeah. And I wasn't sleeping a lot. I was working around the clock, and I was, in a million meetings with.
I remember you during that time. You were very busy.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
I was. And when my dad started to have issues in his home with his partner, we realized pretty quickly that we had to do something.
I want to stop you because you didn't have to, right? I mean, there's a version of events where you say, "Dad, you screwed me up.
Yeah.
This was a totally inappropriate and weird upbringing. You're out of my life now, and I want to stay that way." Why'd you want to help him? And did you want to help him, or did you feel like you had to?
I don't know if I felt like I had to. I did want to. I remember saying that I wanted to.
Why do you think you wanted to?
I think a part of me felt like that was the right thing to do for family. And a big part of this book is really asking that question, like, what do we owe our family? What do we owe the people that raised us? What do we owe each other as family? And at what point do we reciprocate or not the love and care that our family affords us? But I think I also wanted him to want to be family. And that was a very profound motivator for me ultimately.
Okay.
Yeah.
How has your answer to the question changed from before you wrote the book to now? This question, what do we owe our parents? How was Jonathan answering that question before making this book, and how are you answering it now?
I think as a person, I'm not sure if I would do it differently.
Yeah.
I think when I have gone through the process of writing this and reading about the circumstances that many people like myself and my wife went through, I believe we are in a very precarious situation as a society. I think people are living longer.
Yeah.
And as they live longer, they are developing chronic conditions. And the people who their children end up becoming professionals, having family, having people that they have to care for in their own direct lives, cultivating community around their friends and their lives, your life, all the things that make up your life. And then if your parents and grandparents do not set themselves up, you will end up being the last person standing. I mean, a lot of the reason that we ended up becoming responsible for Thomas is because no one else was there. This is a man who lived a life without that plan.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, yesterday I was on air on KQED, and we got a bunch of call-ins from people all over the Bay Area and California who were caring for loved ones, elderly loved ones. And what really stuck out to me is there were two calls right in a row. One from an individual who had a trailer home outside
I remember
of their
that
house.
question.
Yeah. And that person did not have any of the resources to be able to support their loved one. And then another individual who had a lot of wealth and assets and money. And unfortunately, the way that we structure long-term care in this country and healthcare, it's almost worse to have a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
Because you run through all your assets. You have to basically bankrupt the person before the state is going to intervene and support someone. And in my dad's case, particularly with dementia, it's especially difficult because the disease itself operates a lot like old age in the brain. If you were to sort of take the brain scans of somebody with dementia and somebody who's lived a long life, they oftentimes look the same.
Mm-hmm.
The only differentiating factor is how quickly certain parts of the brain shrink.
Mm.
So you can only really measure that over time,
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of the diagnostic piece of it.
Yeah.
So for medical professionals that are trying to diagnose a disease, it looks a lot like old age.
Mm.
And the way that care is administered or like allowed to move to state administered care
Mm-hmm.
is dependent on these diagnoses.
Yep.
So for us, we spent several years supporting him
Mm-hmm.
before he was a vet. So before the Veterans Administration would say, actually, this person needs full-time care, and it just felt like somebody waved a fucking wand, and then all of a sudden he's in a nursing home, and we no longer have to pay for it.
Yeah.
But that could have gone on.
For years.
And especially with dementia, people protect, and I talk about this in the book because his partner did this a lot, protect and hide the characteristics of somebody who's going through a neurodegenerative illness like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How has caring for your father in his old age and with dementia changed how you think about caring for your kids?
I think it has made me more urgent and more
I didn't expect that word.
yeah,
Urgent.
it feels that way. I mean, it's made I'm trying to get the words, you know. I think it's made me feel that the business of parenting and caring for your children
Mm-hmm.
is an urgent affair, because they're only in your house for so many years.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And then also I think it's made it, if I think about what I feel I owe my boys,
Yeah.
I owe them a lot more than I think my parents thought they owed me. And I don't mean that to say like I feel victimized by that at all. I mean more just like, oh, actually, we owe them a shit ton of stuff. We owe them our own physical safety. We owe them our own long-term care and protection. We owe them to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
So that they don't have to go through that or go through what we had to go through.
Yeah. There was something you brought up beautifully when we were on the phone yesterday.
Yeah.
We were talking about kids. Do you have them? Do you not? This, that.
Yeah.
And one thing that you mentioned that really stuck out to me, you said something along the lines of, we also are allowed, whether we have kids or don't, we're allowed to want a life in which we don't owe ourselves exhaustion.
Yeah. Can I
yes.
share what I was responding to in that moment?
Sure.
Not that you need to tell everybody your feelings about kids, but I
Bro,
think
have you heard my shows? That's all I do. Go ahead.
but I said it because I appreciated so much how honest you were about what it means to care for somebody, because you've done it.
Yeah.
And you appreciated the amount of work that goes into caring for somebody who is aging or ailing or sick.
Yeah.
And you understood that makes a person very tired.
Yeah.
And I think we do live, there is a pressure upon us if we love the people, if the people we love are sick.
Yeah. To be all in.
To be all in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also okay and quite beautiful to live a life where you understand that and choose to insulate yourself from that experience. Because it is a choice.
Yeah, and it's all consuming. Long story short, my parents got sick around the same time. I took care of my dad till he died after a few months. And my mother, she was paralyzed for 20 years, but I cared for her for the first 5. And I was telling Jonathan, I was like, you know, hearing your story about what we take from our parents to our children, this and that, I said, I think a lot of it for me is I knew what it was like to be a caregiver to them at the same time while I was like 18. And I'm still exhausted from it. Yeah. And I think part of why I've put off even really seriously considering having kids is that I don't ever want to be that tired again.
Yeah. And you would be.
Right? And I wonder though,
yeah,
you know, you have had to think a lot about parenthood and fatherhood and trauma and generational trauma and what we pass on and what we try not to, what has been the biggest aha that you've unlocked about parenting and having to fully grapple with the parent that your father was or was not?
I think, and I'm not by no means perfect at this. This is a process for me.
Yeah.
But if I'm being perfectly honest, I think your own history and trauma and experiences with your parent get in the way of you being a parent. And I think in a very particular way, which is if you're busy worrying about all the ways in which your parents had a complex relationship with you, you cannot be present for the complex situation of dealing with the emotional life. You are as a parent, you are teaching children how to feel big feelings. And if you can't feel your big feelings, their big feelings will get in the way. Your big feelings will get in the way of you helping them through their big feelings, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I would say that is something I aspire to feel less of. And that is something, if I look at that moment when my dad said, "Oh no," that was the big feeling. "Oh no, a parent? Shit."
Yeah.
Right when he needed to be saying, "Wow, I'm a grandfather."
Yeah. Yeah.
He was still there. And so to me, that was, I think, the big lesson of all this was it's worth going through it all so that you can show up.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I wanted to go through it all in this way, writing it in this way.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I want y'all to ask some questions.
Yes.
I got one more for you though.
Okay.
Because I consider us both former church kids, but like yours was different. But a thing I always love to talk to people about who have left a really serious religious or adjacent to religious experience in their youth is what they worship now. In my youth, I worshiped God so deeply. And there were parts of your young life where there was worship that probably was very deep for you as well. We always worship something, whether we know it or not. What do you think you worship now?
You mean like where do I feel like the engine of meaning comes from?
Whatever you want the word to mean to you.
Me euphemizing this. I think for me, it is storytelling.
That tracks. Yeah.
It is
Why?
stories. Because I find that so far in my professional and creative and personal life, the right story has always arrived at the right time. And it's been that story that has defined whatever it is I was going through personally. Because I found a way into the story, even if it wasn't my story.
Yeah.
Even if it was a documentary about somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, it was like underneath there.
I like that.
Yeah.
You have a really good answer. I just worship rest. I'm usually tired and I want to rest.
Kids, you're not tired.
Thank you for this chat with me.
You.
I know that our audience will have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, that's right.
If you're recording this, I'll make sure to get a mic to folks, but you let me know what you need for that.
Yeah.
We'll just bring a mic. I don't have you going to a mic. Who has questions? I know you do. Yes.
You mentioned your dad's partner. I'll probably hear about this all in the book when I listen to the book. But
yes,
what happened? Is your mom still part of the community, or is she? What's her story with all this?
They both left at the same time. So when I was 17, around 17, a little bit younger than that actually, we left, or my parents decided that we're going to leave. Long story short, my parents were the personal acupuncturists of the guru. When he developed a intimate relationship with another acupuncturist, which would only happen in a cold Northern California where there's like a love triangle between acupuncturists, they chose to leave because they were scorned devotees, lovers, acupuncturists. I mean, it writes itself. Like HBO, come on.
HBO Max.
Yeah. It's back.
It's back, baby.
Bring back the Max. Or the HBO, actually, technically. The HBO. That was an LA joke. But yes, so I didn't want to leave, and they did. Because I had already sort of like adopted the group at the behest of my dad, and then tried to really do it, and then became part of it. But they were together not for very long after that, maybe a year before, and I talk about this in the book, but before my mom discovered my dad's own trysts, and then they decided that it was time to part ways.
More questions? Come on, I know you got them. Don't make me ask more. I got a whole page full of stuff. Yes.
Did your dad know that he was a bad dad? Like, I mean, I know he knew that he shouldn't be a father, but did he reckon with that? And then I don't know. You answered the other part of the question, so I'll just act like I didn't just keep speaking.
That's such a good question. I don't know if he knew. I think it's hard for me to answer that question because I've spent many years trying to see the good dad in there and trying to coax him out or meet him at that place, you know? Like, this is maybe too pop psychology for this, but you know, the idea of adult immature parents. And this is like very...
Go.
But
it's all good.
Oftentimes, if you grow up with parents who are immature or can't like sort of be adults to their kids, a lot of the kids who experience that, or at least from what I've read, have like a reconciliation fantasy. And I definitely probably will always have one of those in which, like, if I did this, this, and this, then he would get it. Then he would really be. So it's hard for me to answer that question because there's a belief that he's in there somewhere and he's not actually bad. But I don't think he thought about it. I think he was so wrapped up in his own beliefs. And especially when you get into that kind of extreme religiosity, it's hard to walk that back and see your role there. Yeah.
Now I have a follow-up. You mentioned the reconciliation fantasy.
Yes.
Did it have a script? Did it have a scene? Did it have a place? Did it have things?
It was Northern California, 1987. Are we writing it now?
I'm just saying, like, did you imagine a certain conversation with certain words said?
I think that day that I came to tell him that that we were having a second boy, I thought that was.
You thought that was going to be it, and then it wasn't. No. What did you want him to say?
I wanted him to say, "Oh my God, this is beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to be a grandfather."
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. Basic.
Not basic. Beautiful. Any more questions?
Can I shout?
Shout. Yeah.
It sounds like the book, from what I understand,
Yeah.
is drawing some connections between the cult, but also losing your dad to dementia. Did it prepare you in any way, or what was the relationship between having already lost your dad to sort of like mentally to this cult, and then physically his mind is you've lost him to dementia?
Yeah.
What was that connection like? What was that process?
You mean like how did the fact that he got wrapped up in a cult like play into my feelings about how he
processing of it's like it seems like you had already learned how to be without a father in a way.
Yeah.
But then you had to go through it all again.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of interesting all the questions tying into this. I think the reason I joined was itself maybe like effort number one at the reconciliation fantasy. And then, you know, over the years of us leaving the group, trying to reconcile with him. I mean, he agreed to be interviewed for Dear Franklin Jones, so that was a moment where I felt like we were gonna get somewhere. And then his reaction to it and us trying to reconcile with him after it, and then him getting sick and being responsible for him and trying then to, like, it did feel like on some level I'd been losing him for a very long time, you know? So through his life as a member of these cults and through his life as someone who was sick, I think it was the same sort of question I was trying to answer, you know?
Let's do one more.
Okay.
If there's one more. Yeah.
My best friend mentions now as a parent, she actively monitors things that she worries from her own childhood that kind of she felt screwed her up.
Yeah.
Is there something that you feel, you know, beyond showing up, which is amazing, that you feel like you actively look for within yourself, like the ways you protected yourself that you don't want to then have happen to your children, or traits that you look out for so that they don't take that from you and absorb it within themselves, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's probably a lot of them, but just to zero in on one that feels like it encompasses a lot of them. And I do believe in generational trauma. Like, there's enough research out there to substantiate the notion that, like, at a cellular level, people who experience extreme environments like what Thomas went through, warfare, does get passed on to your children in some physical way. How you react to that genetic component is everything, all the complexity of genes and all that. So I do believe there is both like a social component of passing on some of those traits and an inherited component, as small as it might be. I say all this to say that, like, the emotional, like, tone that I oftentimes saw Thomas in when he felt slighted or in a rage was precarity. Like a sense that something was gonna happen and the whole thing was gonna go to shit. And I think that is trauma in a nutshell. That sense that the stresses of your environment are going to be so great as to overwhelm the central operating system, the nervous system, and you are not going to be able to function anymore. And I think being exposed to that in his behavior towards me, being exposed to his teacher who oftentimes used manipulative behavior to incite those feelings of precarity, to undermine people's sense of self. Like, we could do a whole conversation about that. I think all of that stuff contributed to a sense that he had, that I in turn absorbed as a person, that there is going to be some stressor that just completely overrides everything, and it's all going to go to hell. And I'm sure a lot of us feel that to a certain degree, but I think if there's any one thing I would hope I got to a place where that was measured against my kids, it would be that. I mean, I would love for them to not feel that ever. That's wishful thinking, but, you know.
We could keep this going for hours because it's getting real good and meaty, but you know the best way to continue this conversation with Jonathan is to listen to the book. Besides folks listening to your new book, how can they help support and get the word out and push this stuff for you? What's the best way for folks to do it?
I mean, yeah, just get a copy, which all of you did because you're here, so thank you, and share it with people. And share it with people who you think would benefit from the conversation that I've been going through. Because my hope is that, if anything, this story, my story and many others, can provide a template for people to both prepare for their lives as their parents get older, as they get older, but also to, you know, find peace in difficult family situations, and to maybe not join.
Don't be joining no cults. Don't do that. Thank you for your openness.
Thank you.
It's helping people. I appreciate you, man.
Appreciate you too.
Thank y'all for being here.